Professor Lennox, it's a pleasure to have you here today in my show. Thank you very much for accepting this interview.
Es un placer para mí también. Muchas gracias.
Well, I was telling you just before we started this video that we should conduct this conversation in Spanish, but you said no, please keep it in English. So we will do so. So the first question would be, we are living in a world that runs away from God, runs away from this, from the transcendental dimension of humanity. It is a world that becomes more utilitarian, more materialistic, and relativistic. How do you view the current state of things? Why do you think this is happening?
I think that kind of naturalistic attitude dominates the academy. You say the world is going that way, but actually, probably a very large percentage of people in the world still do believe in transcendental values. It's just they don't live in the West. The West has largely turned away from God, and that's a very complex thing historically. It has to do with the Enlightenment, and it also has to do with the very vocal activities of some scientists mainly who claim that science and God are incompatible. But what I find is that, particularly among young people around the world, there's increasing interest in revisiting these ideas that many people have rejected, because they discover that if you reject God and the transcendent, you're left with a very small world to live in. And that's difficult. People are questioning materialistic philosophy and attitude as being very superficial. And I discover huge interest when I go online or do lectures around the world in universities. They're filled to overflowing. So I'm hopeful, although I realize that what you say is correct.
And I appreciate that precision that you made, that it's the West, not the world, which is going more secular. It's tending towards secularism. Now, why do you think this faith in science has increased? It's scientism. Why has scientism? Because it's not even atheism at this point. It's another version. It's scientism. Why is this faith in science increasing so badly?
Well, I love the way you put the question, because that's one of my great contentions in the contemporary world, that is the concept of faith. Because many of my atheist friends and people I've debated with, do not recognize that their attitude towards science, and indeed towards atheism, is a faith.
Exactly.
Every person, as far as I can see, is a person of faith. And the question is, what do they believe in? There's a very clever intellectual cop-out used by many atheists, and unfortunately by some friends of mine, where they say faith is a religious word and it means believing where there's no evidence. Well, that's false. It's doubly false. Faith is an ordinary word. It comes from the Latin fides, at least the English version, fe in Spanish, and it carries the ideas of trust and reliability. And every day we exercise faith in uncountable things. And the basic question to ask is, what is the evidence on which you base your faith? If I have faith that England's going to win the World Cup, a lot of people are going to come and say, hey, you've no reason to believe that. Look at this and look at that, look at the other thing. So what is happening, and you rightly say, is that many scientists go beyond science, and they espouse what you have rightly called scientism, which is the belief that science is the only way to truth. It's a sort of epistemological tool, and it's the only way to truth. Now, I'm a mathematician, and I love logic, and I can see straight away that there's something wrong with that statement, because you see, if you say science is the only way to truth, that very statement, science doesn't give you that. It's a philosophical statement. So if science is the only way to truth, then that statement cannot be true. It's
Mhm.
logically self-contradictory. And it's interesting that one of the scientists that I have admired, dead now, Sir Peter Medawar, wrote a marvelous book that every scientist should read called The Limits of Science. And he says very clearly it's so easy to see that science has its limits. It can't even answer the questions, and he refers to Karl Popper, the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? What's the meaning of my life? And Medawar is very clear that you have to go to literature, theology, philosophy for the answers to such questions. But he adds to that, he says, look, if you say that science answers all questions or will eventually be able to, you're actually doing science a disservice. I
Mhm.
think, to sum this up, the danger in our contemporary society is that science, now I mean by that the natural sciences,
Mhm.
that they are coextensive with rationality. And that's sheer nonsense. If science was coextensive with rationality, we'd have to close half the faculties in every university because you wouldn't have literature, history, etc., etc. So
Exactly.
it's a nonsensical position, but it is espoused by some leading people like Richard Dawkins, the late Stephen Hawking, and so on. And therefore, it's powerfully influential. I
Mhm.
can understand, of course, that
Yeah.
science, and I'm passionate about it, is impressive because, particularly of its technological spin offs. But to say that science is the only way to truth is to reject about half of our epistemological sources.
Yes, it's an anti-scientific statement actually.
It
I mean,
is. It is a seriously anti-scientific statement.
yes, because it doesn't. I mean, there's a science has been well, from a philosophical perspective view approach. Positivism underpins a lot of science now. It's very strongly held with positivism, and
Although
they
that was discredited years ago.
no, of course. But I mean, this approach to hard facts, hard observations, empiricism at its most extreme, it rejects its own observations because
Yeah, that's correct.
human beings are have expressions, and the human condition expresses in different ways. It's not only about eating, sleeping, copulating. It's about dreaming. It's about painting. It's about singing. It's about asking the questions that you were saying. What is a meaning? What is the meaning of my life? Those are very human uh, questions. It's part of the human experience. So I think that science does this disservice because it rejects conveniently these aspects of humanity.
It
Now,
does. And one good example of it is when Einstein, who was one of the most able scientists there's ever been, he said, you can speak of the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot speak of the scientific foundations of ethics.
mhm,
And great scientists like Einstein and Richard Feynman and so on have pointed out that science cannot give us morality. Science can tell us that if you put strychnine in your grandmother's tea, it will be fatal for her. But
yeah.
science cannot tell you whether it's right for you to do that to get your hands on her property.
But according to Sam Harris, he actually wrote a book defending the position that you could have a moral basis, that emerged from science, and that's what I think made him quite famous in the world of the new atheists. But of course, that's very hard position to defend. There have been
Yes,
very go
I
ahead.
I I, I delayed the publication of one of my books, which I hope is coming out in Spanish. It's called Gunning for God. When I read Harris's book on Richard Dawkins' defense of it, and in that book, he's trying to get around an objection that was made by the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, where he observed in many writings that people tried to shift from is to ought without justification.
Mhm.
And he said you cannot get an ought from an is. whereas Harris tried to do so, but quite a number of philosophers have examined his writings, including me, and found them to be totally inadequate. He smuggles the ought in right at the beginning.
Yes, exactly. Well, Sam Harris is, although he has moderated a lot, I mean, he's critical now of this culture of cancellation and stuff. But there are other new atheists that some you have mentioned. Peter Hitchens, Peter Atkins. No, not Peter Hitchens.
Peter
Sorry,
Hitchens.
Christopher Hitchens. Peter is the
Peter
opposite.
Hitchens actually is
the opposite. Sorry, Christopher Hitchens, Peter Atkins, Peter Singer, Richard Dawkins, Michael Ruse, who I had just previously in my channel. What do you think are the common questionings that come from new atheism, and what are the main criticisms against Christianity? Just to go with, you summarize it, because you have been through this many times.
I've debated all of the people you mentioned, and they are a spectrum, because Michael Ruse is at the friendly end, Hitchens in the middle, and Dawkins at the extreme other end. I think a lot of it is a failure to see, first of all, that scientism is a non-starter. It simply contradicts itself. Then secondly, what I briefly mentioned earlier, they don't understand the meaning of faith, so that they think that atheists, to quote Hitchens, have no faith. And Hitchens got himself such a twist on this that he once wrote, "Our beliefs are not a belief, our faith is not a faith." They don't know how to cope with it, because what they've done is to substitute or redefine faith, that's the better way of putting it, as what most of us would call blind faith. And then they get into a huge problem. Whereas from where I sit in science, we looked for an evidence base. And as a Christian, I believe my faith in Christ is evidence-based. And so there's a common line of inquiry which they reject. But I think to go a bit further on that, Hitchens was not a scientist, of course, but they tend to be very confused even about the nature of science, which amazes me, because they're very able. And they think, I would place one of the most important issues as the nature of explanation. And Dawkins in particular, and Hawking, they pitched God as an explanation against science as an explanation. And that's nonsensical. You see, let me put it this way. If I ask a class of school children, as I've often done, let me give you two explanations of a motor car engine. One is in terms of the physics of combustion and mechanical engineering, and the other is Henry Ford. Please choose between the two. And even children of 10 will laugh, and they say, don't be silly, you've got to have both. Now, that shows that children can see what I'm afraid some leading professors cannot see, that there are different kinds of explanation. And the Henry Ford explanation and the mechanical engineering and physics explanation do not compete. They do not contradict each other. They complement each other. And it's that failure to see that the God explanation for the universe, say, doesn't compete with the scientific explanation at all. My colleague in Oxford, Richard Swinburne, a very eminent philosopher, says, science explains, but I postulate God to explain why science explains. And I think that's exactly it. And that's why I live utterly comfortably with the view of the great pioneers of science, Galileo, Newton, Kepler, and all the rest of them, who were motivated by their faith in God to study the universe. They saw no conflict at all because they weren't giving competing explanations.
Which is a main criticism that the new atheists make, or atheists in general make is that you cannot be a scientist and you cannot be religious, because when you are religious, you become like basically dumb. Like religion makes you dumber, and you have all these you have these huge black swans, the guys that you have just mentioned, that disprove completely this utterly stupid claim that people with religious views and faith are discarded from scientific activity. It's absolutely silly. Well,
It is silly. It is silly. And it's very important to say exactly why. Firstly, the Judeo-Christian tradition is the birthplace of modern science. That's not a question for most historians of science.
That's a fact.
And Alfred North Whitehead, that's the author, famous philosopher and historian, was where I first came across it. But C.S. Lewis' summary of his work is much better, where Lewis said,
by the way, you attended you attended one of his lectures, no? C.S. Lewis.
I attended his last lectures in 1962. That makes me old.
But wise.
Old, I don't know about that. But Lewis said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. And you see, I'm not ashamed of being a mathematician and a Christian believer, because arguably it was the Judeo-Christian tradition that gave me my subject. And many people today are very surprised when I tell them that in the 100 years between 1900 and 2000, over 65% of Nobel Prize winners believed in God. There's just no contradiction here. And I often say, look, it's very easy to see where the problem lies. Let's take the Nobel Prize for physics.
Mm-hmm.
It was won by a Scotsman a few years ago, Peter Higgs, for the Higgs boson.
Yes.
Now, Peter is a very friendly atheist. But that same Nobel Prize was won a few years earlier by an American physicist who is a Christian. Now, what divides those two men? It's not their science. They both won the Nobel Prize. It's their worldview. One is a theist and the other is an atheist. And I want to say to people today, look, the tension is not between science and religion, even though you've been told it is. The tension is between two diametrically opposed worldviews, atheism and theism. And here's the important thing, there are equally bright people on both sides. Mm-hmm. So what you've got to decide is, if you're thinking about science, whether science, as Richard Dawkins says, favors atheism, or whether, as I would say, and many others, that science points towards the existence of God. And that's the real question. But don't tell me that science and faith in God are in essential conflict. Of course, one must say that science may well be in conflict with some religious statements. And I can only speak for Christianity because I'm a Christian. Other religions must rightly speak for themselves.
That's a very important precision. It's not against religion, but perhaps some religious statements, which is a completely different thing.
Yes, correct.
Mm-hmm. And I would say it's not a scientific dispute as it wants to be put out. It's more a political dispute.
Yes, political and philosophical, absolutely.
Political and philosophical, exactly. Now, let's say, because I don't want to repeat I just wanted to give this introduction so my audience knows more or less your views. They can go to several videos on YouTube where you have debated many people on these subjects. But I would like to go to, let's say, more philosophical questions or more thoughtful questions in terms of not just the divide, but for instance, you're a mathematician. And mathematics is it's the most hard science that you can find. It's factual and it's axiomatic. It's just the level of objectivity is supreme. How can you can you explain the existence of God? And this is one of the questions. Can you explain the existence of God in mathematical terms? Is this possible?
The word explain is the problem. Let me illustrate that at a much simpler level, but it's not simple. Let's take the law of gravity. When I went to school, I thought the law of gravity explained gravity, but it doesn't. Newton realized that when I came to read him later. The law of gravity gives us a wonderful mathematical way of calculating what we can rather crudely regard as the effects of gravity, which is a warping of space-time, but we needn't go into that. But it doesn't tell us what gravity is. Mm-hmm. So we need to be hugely careful, because even in science, what is called an explanation usually only covers part of the story. So that when you say, can you explain God? I would rather say to you, I believe that there is evidence for the existence of God in the fact that we can do mathematics, but it doesn't explain God. Even more so, if you said to me, can you explain your wife? If you see what I mean, I've got evidence for her existence, but to explain her, that's way beyond the dimensions of human thought for any wife, by the way.
Yes.
Let me come then to the evidence side. See, I'm a mathematician, and because of what you said earlier, of its exactness and so on, mathematics is unique. Science doesn't give mathematical proof of anything, because proof in mathematics, as you say, axiomatic system, where you start with a set of axioms and you've got an agreed logic and you come to firm conclusions. You only get that in pure mathematics. You don't get it in physics or chemistry or anything else. What you get there is pointers, evidence, indicators. Now, that doesn't mean that the results are insecure. It's a kind of proof beyond reasonable doubt. And the problem here is that the word proof is used in most languages in two senses. One is the rigorous mathematical sense, and the other is the legal sense, proof beyond reasonable doubt. So let's take mathematics. One of the reasons I believe in God is that mathematics can be done and gives us insight into the universe. Now, many people have never thought of this. Einstein, he put it this way: the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And beloved of many mathematicians is a paper written in 1961 by Eugene Wigner, also a Nobel Prize winner, called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. Wigner and Einstein were amazed. How does it work that somebody thinking in their mind can come up with precise equations that describe the motion, say, of the planets and the universe out there? Wigner thought it was unreasonable. I think it's reasonable, because the difference between me and Wigner is he's an atheist working on atheist principles, where it is very unreasonable. But it's not unreasonable if you come to the position of Galileo, Newton, Kepler, Clark, Maxwell, who thought that mathematics can be done because the same rational mind that's behind the universe is behind the human mind. They are both creations of a transcendent God. So there, for me, the very doing of mathematics evidences to me that this is what I call a word-based universe, both in its mathematical describability and then at another level in the genetic descriptors of the human genome, the longest word we've ever discovered. And that fits beautifully to my mind with a profound statement at the beginning of the Gospel of John, the New Testament. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was God. All things came to be. That's an ontological existence statement. All things came to be through the Word. That fits and all my experience as a mathematician, scientist, philosopher, everything else, that makes far more sense, whereas atheism doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, it calls upon this need, this desire, always this human desire to know everything, to its curiosity, its desire to supersede its natural limits or limitations, physical, intellectual stuff. Now I have talked a lot about transhumanism. I don't know if you're aware of this movement.
Oh, yes. I'm
Yes.
very aware of it. I've just written a book about it.
Yes, and
I've
exactly.
written a book called 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity.
Mhm.
And I have been very interested in the movement beyond beyond humanity as it is today, particularly as advocated by people like Yuval Noah Harari
You
in
know.
his book Homo Deus. So I've actually written a great deal about this.
So let's start with a question to position this part of the conversation. What does human mean? What does it mean being human? What is being human? What does that mean? If you should explain someone, what does a human
Well,
mean?
again, I could give some descriptors, but explanation is too big a word. What I would say the central thing about human beings is they are beings created by an intelligent personal God in his image. And it's that statement in Genesis that I think is utterly fundamental. I was watching one of Jordan Peterson's fascinating lectures on Genesis recently, and he came to that statement, let us make man in our own image, and God made them male and female. He said, look, this is the foundation of all civilization. I think he's right. It gives the value and dignity to human beings that they, unique of all creation, are made in God's image. I love astronomy. I've actually got an observatory, a tiny one with a big telescope in my garden.
Mm-hmm.
And the heavens declare the glory of God. But they're not made in God's image. Human beings are. So I think the God-centered definition of humans is the fundamental one. And I'm very aware that that's what is rejected by so many people today. So they're left wondering, who am I? And the search for meaning is one of the most important searches that particularly young people, but everybody really is looking for today.
Yes, exactly. We have this, as we were discussing at the beginning, this need to take God out of the equation and create, because transhumanism at the end would be creating humans at the image of humans, or the dreams of humans.
That is the interesting thing and the terrifying thing. You know, in 1940, C.S. Lewis saw this. And he wrote, there are two books that I think are prescient. They saw what was coming. One is called The Abolition of Man, and the other is the third volume in C.S. Lewis' science fiction trilogy called That Hideous Strength. And he pointed out that if we ever get to the place where human beings have got control over the generations to come, then what will be produced will be in the image of those human beings, and it will be not human, but an artifact. Now, Harari is reviving some of that, and it has interested me greatly to see that this idea of moving beyond the human, either by genetic technology and drugs and all this kind of thing, or by linking humans to technology and machinery and cyborg development, so that in the end we have something that's part human, part machine, and maybe even in the distant future the robots take over, so to speak.
Yes, but the point here is, no, sorry, so you wanted to say something.
No, that's fine.
It is, let's put it in more practical terms, in the daily life, in our daily lives. You have, for example, the youth is exposed subtlety, subliminally. All the time they are talking about, or they are being exposed to transhuman things, the X-Men, the Avengers, this mix between humans and animals and aliens, all of them with superpowers.
Yes.
And this goes constantly. It's brainwashing at the highest level, disguised as entertainment, as documentaries. Now, on the other hand, so you have this offer. You can become Tony Stark and Iron Man, or you can follow a life of virtue, sacrifice. And perhaps if you become virtuous and a good person, you may enter the kingdom of God. Now, the one offers, paradise on earth. The other one offers a path of sacrifice and commitment to others. I don't think it's very difficult for a youngster to pick up one of those options. You would have to be quite special to choose the other side, the side of the commitment, of the sacrifice. Do you think this is... No, tell me.
I think that's absolutely right, and I feel it's certainly my responsibility to try to show to people that trying to reach utopia without facing fundamental problems like the flaws in human nature has always led to a horrific bloodbath. The 20th century has been the most horrific century of all. And interestingly, millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people have died in the interest of perfecting humanity. It's such a horrific irony. And I think, therefore, people need to be informed. Of course, young people love playing with their machines and all this kind of thing. And it is a danger, as people like Sherry Turkle point out, the danger of virtual reality becoming reality and people preparing it.
Yes.
So I think the important thing is to do what you're doing and what I'm trying to do, and to make people actually aware that this seems a very attractive solution, but actually it is fraught with all kinds of problems. That's one of the reasons I wrote my book 2084, because in 1984, George Orwell predicted all kinds of things that are already come to pass. And we're now accelerating the concept. So what 2084 is going to be like is almost unimaginable. Even 2024 may bring enough dangers.
But there's a difference, of course, and all these were secular experiments that rejected God. That the most crimes were committed in this militant secularism.
Correct.
Now we are living in a different time with different technologies, the so-called converging technologies like artificial intelligence, CRISPR, gene editing, which is very powerful, nanotechnology, robotics, etc. And these technologies offer potentially, they can potentially change human nature, like dramatically. What is your take on, for example, genetic manipulation? Because that transhumanist dream could become real. They talk about enhancing human beings. Actually, what they are doing is modifying human beings. We don't know.
That's right. And I want to make a distinction between the two, although there's clearly a gray area. I'm using enhancement talking to you because I'm wearing glasses. And that kind of enhancement is clearly a very useful thing. And I could be wearing contact lenses and you wouldn't see those so easily. And you can see that people will develop all kinds of things that are artificial. I have various bits and pieces, one in my heart and some in my mouth that nature didn't give to me. But it seems to me that you've put your finger on the really important thing and that is when you alter the specification of what a human being is. Now, I'm going to say something that may startle some of your listeners, but it's very important to me. I talked about humans being made in the image of God. Now, if that is true, then for humans to take themselves in hand and alter that genetic specification is likely to lead to all kinds of dangers and difficulties. And the transhumanists will say, well, humans 101 aren't good enough. We're in the process of becoming and we can modify ourselves and so on. But one huge consideration for me, which they will laugh at, of course, but it still is very much the center of my Christianity, is that God's approval on human beings and their uniqueness is seen by the fact that he himself became one. That's the central Christian claim. The Word became human and dwelt among us, and Christ is God become human. Now, that's a huge claim, of course, to make in the 21st century, as it was in the first century. But because, as a scientist, I don't illogically rule out a supernatural and transcendent dimension, I focus on that, and that warns me that we need to be very careful before we introduce irreversible things into the stream of conscious humanity. We know so little. You read the transhumanist goals, and yet we don't even know what consciousness is. And the idea that they'd be able to make a conscious being is very remote, as I read in the serious literature.
Or to morally enhance ourselves through genetic manipulation. I just find it absolutely, utterly stupid. I'm sorry, but as you said...
well, that's okay. I will go along with that 100%.
Well, the thing is that at Oxford University has departments now with Hiro Center for Practical Ethics with Julian Savulescu. He promotes this moral enhancement.
Oh, I know that. And Nick Bostrom as well.
Nick Bostrom at the Future of Humanities Institute. So we can say that academically speaking, although Savulescu doesn't define himself as a transhuman, but Bostrom does openly. He was the founder of the World Transhumanist Association. Right. So we can say that academia is legitimizing transhumanism at a certain extent, and
hugely.
And this must be truly, I don't know if worrying, but it must catch your attention as a Christian.
Oh, it has caught my attention, and if people look at my book 2084, they'll see I've written quite a bit about it, including the Oxford Institute for the Future of Humanity.
For the Future of Humanities. Well, you have written a lot of books. At the end of this video, I'm going to make I'm going to make a series of books that people can buy from you. I hope there are some in Spanish. If not, I'll still put
there are.
Excellent.
There are an increasing number in Spanish, particularly in the last 2 weeks. My book, Can Science Explain Everything?
Yes.
Has appeared in the Spanish language, and that's one of the most popular of my books.
Wonderful. You are also there's a documentary that was just released by Caris Productions, which is called Against the Tide, which reminisces of the title of the book, Against the Flow.
Yes,
Against the Tide, where Kevin Sorbo interviews you. I'm also going to add the link to that video. It's like a documentary style video where Professor Lennox talks about going against the tide in this world of secularism, anti-Christianity, anti-knowledge, and anti-common sense.
Yes, that film, by the way, I'm pretty sure is subtitled in Spanish.
Wow! Oh, wonderful! So I'll find the version.
It's available at the moment on Blu-ray and DVD, and it will, I hope, very soon be available streaming. But it's subtitled in 7 or 8 languages already.
Okay, Professor. Well, we are going to come to the closure of this interview. Just the last. It's a question and a reflection from your part. We see we are living in a period where Christianity is being openly attacked. Let's not come up with half terms here. It is openly attacked, and faith or Christian faith is receding. It's not disappearing, but you can see that the numbers are going down, and they are becoming
in the West.
Exactly. In spite of this, do you have a message what's your position? Are you hopeful that in the future this will change? In the event, what would happen to Christian faith is if ideologies or movements like transhumanism become more, more settled, more widespread? Does Christianity and does the Christian faith have still some space? Does God?
Oh,
still have?
I think enormously so, because Christianity can bring us back to the roots of what it means to be human, as we were discussing.
Mhm.
And many of the transhumanist ideals will only be realized at vast expense, and will force an even greater division between the rich and the poor. And the wonderful thing about the Christian faith is we can have a transformation. Now, in my book 2084, I explain this carefully. You see, I meet transhumanists, and the two goals that Harari has for transhumanism in the 21st century are, firstly, a solution to the problem of physical death. He regards it as a merely technical problem, and it will be solved by medical science. And then we get on with the second agenda point, which is the enhancement of human happiness. And human beings won't have to die, but they can live forever, and we're going to enhance happiness, either by uploading our brains onto silicon or something like this. Now, when I hear that, I get slightly amused, because I say to the first question, look, you're trying to solve the problem of human death, but it has been solved. It was solved 20 centuries ago when Jesus rose from the dead. Now, not only that, but if the Christian message is true, it answers directly your second problem. You're worried about having some sense of eternal existence, of going on and on forever. Well, Christ promises that those who trust him and receive him and turn away from the mess they've made of their own lives and the lives of other people, actually in this life receive eternal life, God's life. And because he rose from the dead, one day he will raise them from the dead. And that will be the most wonderful uploading. And I say, look, I compare your transhumanist scenarios, for which there's very little evidence actually, with the biblical scenario, for which I believe there's a lot of hard evidence. And so I go with that because that gives me real hope. And the one thing that so many people are looking for, which is why they follow the transhumanism, is that they see hope there. My motive for writing the book was to show actually there's an even better hope, whatever transhumanism holds, and it's to be found in the Christian faith.
Mm-hmm. Well, wonderful closure for this wonderful interview. I am going to apologize to some of my viewers. Some will know more about you, and you will say, "Why didn't you ask this question and that other question?" Because I only had limited time. Trust me. But I have tried to make a different interview in the sense of, exploring a little bit these angles of transhumanism, and of course, going back to some of your foundational statements and your foundational discourses. It has been a pleasure, Professor, and I feel absolutely honored. I will cherish this experience forever, and it will be documented, which will make me extremely happy. And I think you are a light of you. I don't know. I know you won't like what I will say, but I will say it anyways because it comes from me. You are a never mind. You see, they don't complain that this is spontaneous. It's absolutely spontaneous, and you are a light of hope, and you're a light of wisdom, and you're an inspiration for many people like me who want to always seek truth. And I think that's the most important. You stand as a figure that inspires people to seek truth, and I think that's very, very powerful. So thank you very much. It has been my honor and my pleasure, and I wish you all the best in your future projects and life.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this immensely, and I hope we get the chance to do it again, because it was one of the best interviews I've had for a long time.
Thank you so very much. And sorry, you have threatened me with having you again in my show, so I will take that word for sure. I will have you again. let's say in a couple 3-4 months, if you feel okay, I will get in touch with you, and I promise I'll get in touch with you again. Thank you,
It would be
Professor
a
Lennox.
real pleasure.
Thank you,
Lovely to
Professor
meet-
Lennox.
Okay.
See you then. Bye.